Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we're going to be ranking all 8 United Football League schedules from easiest to hardest. Now, this is a pretty difficult list to make considering the fact that all these teams play each other a minimum of one time, thanks to, only having 8 teams. But there are some schedules that are much harder than others, whether that be where you have to travel or certain stretches of games that you have that are insanely tough. So this is a list that was pretty hard to make, but some of these schedules are pretty daunting, and 2 of them are pretty easy. Before we get into that, we are about to hit 500 subscribers, and we are doing a Q&A at 500 subscribers. So if you have any questions you want to ask me, whether it be about the United Football League, about other YouTubers, about myself, or anything, leave them down in the comments below. Without further ado, let's get started with number 8, the easiest schedule of the 2024 United Football League season, the Birmingham Stallions. I mean, this one should be obvious from the simple fact that they are the number 1 team in the league, and them and the number 2 team, the Defenders, naturally have the massive benefit of not having to play, against themselves. But the Stallions also get the spot because they get insanely lucky. The Battlehawks at the moment, thanks to them not having a legit quarterback, are not a daunting team to play unless you go to St. Louis. If you're going to St. Louis, that's a nightmare. You have to play in front of, without a doubt, it's going to be over 30,000 fans again. So if you have to go to St. Louis, it's going to be a nightmare. But the Stallions, they're at home when they play the Battlehawks. So they just have to deal with the Battlehawks team that currently doesn't have a legit QB. And overall a team that is just a good team that comes to Birmingham. And DC, they're another awful place to play at. And they are the second best team in the league. And guess what? The Stallions get them at home as well. The Stallions get insanely lucky because of the fact that the USFL Conference, you don't have that guaranteed game at St. Louis, and you only have to play the Defenders once. So the Stallions luck out. They don't have to play themselves twice, naturally, since they are the Stallions. When they play the Defenders and Battlehawks, they have both of them at home. So when they have to travel, it's to San Antonio, which is a big whoop. What a difficult game. And the only true nightmarish game is Week 1 against the Renegades at Arlington. But Arlington is not the daunting home field place, but it is going against the XFL reigning champion. So that is the tough game, but I think pretty much every team would rather play at Arlington than at DC or St. Louis. So the easiest schedule is easily the Stallions. Now, coming in number 7 for similar-ish reasons is going to be Arlington Renegades. Now, look, the Arlington Renegades do have to play DC twice. But the fact is that they get pretty lucky with where the games are and all that. So week 1, they get to play Birmingham, which is naturally bad, but they get them at home. They don't have to go to Birmingham, which is, I would say, the third worst place to play at is Birmingham because of their fan base and all that. So you get lucky by dodging that bullet. So while you do have to get them out of the way early and then week 2 go to St. Louis, which is awful, and then play DC, you get DC at home. So at the very start of the season, even though it's a nightmarish start in terms of the 3 teams you play and where, you do get 2 of them at home. So it's not far-fetched to see them coming out of that 1-2 or even 2-1, despite those 3 places being awful, or 3 places or teams awful to play. But then you have an insanely, and I mean insanely easy 5-game stretch comparatively. Now yes, the Showboats are probably going to be much better of a team in the second half of the season than the first half of the season. So that game against Memphis could be scary. But again, they dodge having to go to Memphis. They get the Showboats at home. So even though the Showboats should be as good as we think they're going to be at that point in the season, they get them at home so they don't have to go and travel. And then you get to go to Houston and Michigan. Those are the 2 places you'd want to go to, whether it be because of the team or the fan base. Those are the 2 you want to go play at. You do not want to play at Memphis or at Birmingham. So they dodge those 2 bullets by having to go to Michigan and Houston. And then they get the Brahmas in part of that 5-game stretch twice, who are, aside from the Panthers, currently the weakest team in the league. So you have a really great 5-game stretch, and then your final 2 games, you get to play St. Louis at home, which, as I said earlier, isn't that bad. And you do end the season with DC, which is pretty awful. But essentially, once you get past those first 3 games and the last single game, you have really a 6-game stretch where they could realistically go 5-1 or even 6-0 in that stretch. So the Renegades, while it is close with the team that I have above them, I think that overall they have the second easiest schedule on the list. Now, coming in number 6 is going to be the Defenders. The Defenders have the benefit the Stallions do. You don't have to play the Defenders twice because you are the Defenders. Now, with them, the reason I'm putting them as a slightly harder schedule than the Renegades is mainly because of the fact they do have to go to Arlington and then Birmingham back-to-back. It's a pretty awful back-to-back. And I don't know, it's tough. Like 6 and 7 I think are very interchangeable. It depends exactly what you want. Do you want to have the very easy beginning that the Defenders do? They have arguably the easiest opening 2 weeks in the entire league, going to San Antonio and then getting Houston at home. But then granted, you have 2 awful away games where you have to go to Arlington, then go to Birmingham. And then you do get a 3-game stretch that's pretty nice. You get the Battlehawks at home, you get the Brahmas at home, and the Panthers at home. But then you have to travel to St. Louis, travel to Memphis at the end of the season when they should be, again, the second half of the season, they should be fully put together, fully acclimated to DeFilippo's schemes and all that and each other. And then week 10, you play the defending champions at home. That final 3-game stretch is pretty terrible. That's a pretty hard one to go through, and it's one of those where a 1-2 record would be definitely serviceable at that point. But you have a very easy opening 2 weeks. You do have 2 awful weeks back-to-back following that. But I think that they're overall just a teeny bit harder than the Renegades, despite not having to play, a dominant team twice. I think that because of the fact that their final 3 games are so terrible, mixed with having those 2 back-to-back awful games at Arlington and at Birmingham, I think 6 is a fair spot. It's still one of the easiest schedules. It's just not one of the 2 easiest. Now, the 4th easiest schedule, or the 5th hardest schedule, is going to be the Memphis Showboats. The Showboat schedule is kind of hard. See, this spot and the next one are pretty close, but I'm giving the Showboats 5. So when you look at the Showboats, they have the other arguable easiest opening 2 weeks at Houston versus San Antonio, which I would argue is probably the easiest 2 weeks. San Antonio's week 1 attendance last year was really good, and maybe that's the same this year. So maybe, it's worse for DC in that regard. But when you look at this team, all in all, you go to Birmingham, and then you go to St. Louis. That's terrible. So again, you have the 2 easy games, then the 2 nightmare games, just like we saw in the last one. And then you get a 1-week break with the Panthers, but then you have to play Birmingham at home, then travel to Arlington. So you are stuck going to Arlington. But your week 9 game, you get DC at home. So you dodge that bullet. Yes, you have to go to St. Louis, but you dodge having to go to DC. And then week 10, you have to play Houston, which is, I think starting and ending your season with Houston is really solid. Essentially, Houston, at least on paper, are a team that it is very much a horrifying defense. But an offense that feels, at least at the moment, since we haven't seen any of the QBs play in spring football really, feels like an offense that you just have to stop the run. But the defense is the nightmarish part. But in terms of an overall cohesive unit, because of the fact that they're just like the Battlehawks where they have a current lack of QB, they're one of the teams you'd want to face earlier or later on in the season. So all in all, when you look at the schedule, it's pretty tough. This is where you start getting to the pretty tough ones because having to play Birmingham, then go to Arlington, then 2 weeks later you have to play DC. It's pretty tough, as pretty much the first 2 games and the last game are all easy. You could realistically go 3-0 in those games. But then that mid-7-week stretch, starting from week 3 to week 9, that's going to be tough. That's tough. As aside from the 2 games with the Panthers, they're all just awful teams you have to play. So I think that 5 is a solid spot for this one. I think this is where you start getting into the true hard schedules, is this one. Now, number 4 is going to be the Michigan Panthers. The Panthers get insanely lucky with St. Louis. I know some people think that this opening back-to-back is a nightmarish back-to-back opening week. I don't really see it that way, at least at the moment. Now, if McCarron comes back, then we're talking about really terrifying, with that Battlehawks team. But at the moment, the Battlehawks don't look to be that, nightmare team to play at home. They just look like to be a nightmare team to play on the road going to St. Louis. So that game is a bit tough, but you do also have the Stallions at home. So 1-1 is very feasible with that start. In fact, 3-1 is very, very possible when you consider the fact their next 2 games are the Roughnecks and San Antonio Brahmas. So you may be wondering, why is this above the Showboats? Well, it's because you have a 6-week back-to-back of just, pretty terrible. Your easiest game is probably at Houston because you get to go to Memphis in week 5 when they should be, as I said, about the second half, midway of the season, they should be getting fully acclimated. Case Cookus, Victor, DeFilippo, all of them. So you go to Memphis after going to San Antonio, and that Memphis team should be really good at that point. Then you have to play the defending XFL champions, who, thankfully for the Panthers, they get at home. But then you have to travel to DC. Then you have to play the Showboats again, then travel to Houston, then travel to Beeham. 3 of their home games are in the first 3 weeks of the season. So from week 4 to week 10, they only have 2 home games. They're on the road almost the entire rest of the season after the first 3 games. And that's a big deal. Having to consistently travel is pretty awful for them. So I think that overall, while I could buy an argument to why this is easier than the Showboat schedule, I think that when you consider the fact that you have so many road games very close together, you consider the fact that you do have to go to DC, you have to go to Houston and Beeham to finish the season, I'm putting this one at number 4. Now, the third hardest schedule in the league is going to be the St. Louis Battlehawks. I mean, it kind of makes sense with this team when you think about it. Look, week 1 you have to go to Michigan. That's not really that big a deal. But then week 2 you do have to play Arlington. You do get them at home. Then week 3 you go to San Antonio, which isn't awful, as we talked about. You get the Showboats at that point where they're probably in transition at the last week or 2 of transition. They might be really good at that point. They might not be. But then you go to DC. You have to go to Beeham in week 7. You have to play DC again in week 8. You have to go to Arlington in week 9. Yeah. Pretty much 3 to 5 are all very close together. But I put this one as the hardest one, mainly because of the fact that you do have to go to Birmingham. That's a really tough thing to have to do that. And you do have to play DC and Arlington twice. Those are a couple scary teams to have to play twice, and is the big, downside to being in the XFL conference is you have to play a team that's, while on paper much weaker than a lot of other teams, they still are playing as the defending champions in the Renegades. And then you have to play the team that on paper is the best team in the XFL conference and second best overall in defenders. So 4 of your games are already tough. Add the 5th being you go to Birmingham. It's tough. The benefit for them is the fact that they could start the season 3-1 by losing to Arlington but winning against San Antonio, Michigan, and Memphis, as long as Memphis isn't fully, acclimated at that point. But if they do get good at that point, then that's another tough game. So I think that overall, 3 to 5 are interchangeable, but I'm putting the Battlehawks at 3. Now, coming in at number 2 is going to be the Houston Roughnecks. Yeah, the Roughnecks I'm putting at 2. The more I looked at their schedule, the more I was like, wow, this actually is pretty tough. Because your first and last games are in Memphis. The first one, in theory, should be a free win. You're playing the Showboats in their first game as this, full team with all the guys they drafted, the influx of breakers, the influx of high-end talent from other teams, the new head coach. You should win that game at home. But then week 10, when they should be fully together, you have to go to Memphis. So awful end of the season. But then you look at the rest of it, and it's week 2, you go to DC. Terrible. Week 3, you go to Michigan. You'd rather not go to Michigan because week 4 and 5 versus Arlington versus Birmingham. Then week 6, you go to St. Louis because, yes, the USFL team that has to deal with going to both DC and St. Louis is the Roughnecks. So the Roughnecks have really this trilogy of absolutely awful games, Arlington, Beeham, and St. Louis. Then you do get San Antonio at home, which is, again, you'd much rather have DC or St. Louis at home. And then week 8, you have to go to Birmingham. This is a really bad schedule. It really is. I mean, week 2 to week 8, you have one game that's really not that bad. Because you do, Michigan is because you're going to Michigan, but it's just like San Antonio, going to Houston is But the fact that you have 2 games maybe in that stretch that are winnable, in theory, is just not good. And then week 10 being at Memphis is an awful way to end the season. The second worst schedule in the league. You have to play the Stallions twice. You have to go to both St. Louis and DC. You have to go to Memphis at the final week of the season. Awful. But number 1 is, of course, going to be the San Antonio Brahmas. Is this really a shock? Like when you picture all the XFL teams, what's the odd man out? What's the one that has no real benefit of a home field advantage? What's the one that isn't the defending champ? What's the one that isn't the best team on paper? The Brahmas. So already you have awful games just like that. You have to play DC twice. You have to go to St. Louis and you have to play Arlington twice. Now, the only benefit they get is that they get Birmingham at home, which is good. But the issue is everything else. Your final 3 weeks are Arlington, Birmingham, at St. Louis. Awful. Yes, they dodge a bullet by getting both Arlington and Birmingham at home in that stretch, but that's a stretch that they realistically could go 0-3 in. Mix in their opening game being against DC, they could easily start 0-1. Then week 5 and 6, you have to go to Arlington and then DC. That's pretty tough. I mean, really. 4 and 6 for this team would be the nobody would be shocked record. Let's be very clear. Could they win at Memphis? Yes, it's early in the season. The Sherwoods might not be fully, together. They could win that game. Could they beat St. Louis at home? Definitely. Could they beat Michigan at home? Definitely. So they're 3-1 at that point. But then they lose the next 2 to Arlington and DC. Then they go to Houston. Maybe they get the win there. They're looking high and mighty. They're 4-3. Uh-oh. Arlington, they lose. Uh-oh. Birmingham, they lose. Uh-oh. St. Louis, they lose. 4-6, they miss the playoffs. 4-6 would be a very understandable finish for them. And it's that issue that your final 3 weeks are just awful. You have an awful week 1, and then you have an awful middle of the season schedule. So not only do you have to play pretty much all the teams that you don't want to play more than anyone else, but you also have to deal with the fact that they're just placed horribly for you. So the Brahmas are the hardest schedule in the United Football League's 2024 season. So that'll do it for this list. Let me know if you agree with these or if you have any that you disagree with. As I said, I think 3 to 5 are very interchangeable. They're pretty close to each other. But the rest of the list, I feel very confident in those ones. Make sure if you have any questions to ask me, leave them down in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe. Maybe you'll be the 500th subscriber. We're just a couple away from that. And as always, guys, have a great night.